Around 5:15 p.m. on Sunday, May 22, 2011, 16-year-old Stephen Weersing was riding in the passenger seat of his friend Johnny's car as they barreled through the streets of Joplin, Missouri. It was a perfect spring day. They had the windows rolled down, and their friend Dylan, who was in the back seat, was singing along to the Blink-182 song that was blasting from the radio. And as they drove, Stephen stuck his right arm out the window to feel the wind, and as he did, he admired the tattoo that ran the length of his right forearm. The tattoo spelled Stephen's last name in a style that sort of looked like graffiti. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, and although he loved it, his parents did not, and they were still upset that he had actually gotten it. But Stephen didn't really care. Stephen turned around and asked Dylan to pass up the bag of potato chips they'd just bought at the store. Dylan took one more handful and then thrust the bag forward, and as Stephen grabbed the bag, big raindrops began hitting the windshield. Johnny quickly rolled up the windows, and when Stephen looked outside, he noticed the sky had gone from, slightly overcast to now very dark gray. Stephen instinctively turned down the volume on the radio and then said to his friends that it looked like a serious storm was coming. Johnny nodded and said he would start driving back to his house in South Joplin where they could all wait out the storm together. But just 5 minutes later, as Johnny weaved through the back roads of the small city, the drizzling rain became a full-on downpour, and strong winds began to shake the car. Stephen leaned close to the windshield, trying to see through the heavy rain smashing into it to try to help his friend find the correct turn. But then something bounced off the window right in front of Stephen's face, startling him and causing everybody in the car to gasp. Stephen quickly realized that they were all kind of overreacting. It was just a stick that had hit the windshield, and for a second, Stephen wanted to laugh. But then all three boys heard off in the distance the ominous sound of a tornado siren, loud and clear even through the pounding rain. Growing up in a part of the country that's sometimes called Tornado Alley, Stephen and his friends had been through their fair share of tornadoes, and so they'd heard these sirens before. Normally, storms didn't really scare Stephen, but he could already tell that this tornado, was different. It had come on with almost no warning, and now more sticks and rocks were beating the sides of the car, and the gray sky had taken on a sickly orange tint. Johnny, who was white-knuckling the steering wheel at this point, turned to Stephen and Dylan and said, "Hey, we're almost at my house. I'm going to try to outrun the storm." And then Johnny hit the gas, turned right, and the rain actually suddenly stopped. For a moment, all Stephen and his friends could hear was just the urgent wail of the tornado siren. But then this overwhelmingly loud rumbling noise like a jet engine made Stephen suddenly cover his ears. And then pieces of cement and plywood began crashing into the car, this time shattering the passenger side window and filling the car with broken glass. Stephen turned to his friends, absolutely terrified, and he could see from all their looks that they were scared too. And then Stephen realized that the reason the rain had just stopped for a second is because Johnny had just unknowingly driven directly into the path of the tornado. But now there was basically nothing they could do. Johnny continued to try to drive, but the car began to shake harder and harder, and then Stephen felt the entire vehicle literally rise off the ground until none of the wheels were touching the road. Stephen and the others did their best to try to shield their bodies from all the debris flying through the broken window, but as the car began to spin faster and faster in midair, Stephen felt the wind pulling him out of the car. He screamed and his friends grabbed his legs, frantically trying to keep him inside. And then, as suddenly as the car had risen off the ground, it came smashing back down onto the street, landing on its roof and throwing the three teenagers out onto the street. But the tornado was not finished with them yet. Stephen's friends gripped the car to brace themselves against the strong winds, but Stephen had fallen further away from the vehicle, and he was again swept back up into the swirling vortex, this time with no car around him to protect him. Stephen watched as his friends grew smaller and smaller as Stephen was sucked farther up into the air. For just a moment, Stephen was acutely aware of the roaring wind and the debris pummeling him from all sides, and then everything went black. On the other side of town, Stephen's father, David, listened to the weather report on TV while he made sure all of his windows were shut and locked. The meteorologist said that a giant, mile-wide tornado was wreaking havoc on the southern part of Joplin, with winds blowing over 200 miles per hour. But even people who lived further north, like David, should still take cover. Just then, David's landline phone rang, and when he picked it up, he heard his ex-wife, Carissa, speaking, and she sounded very concerned. She asked David if he had heard from either of their sons. Ever since David and Carissa had gotten divorced, the couple shared custody of their kids, and both boys were staying at David's house that weekend. Carissa said she'd been trying to get in touch with the boys to warn them about the tornado, but she couldn't get in touch with them. Neither of them were answering their phones. David told Carissa that he had spoken to their younger son, Nathan, and he was safe, but he hadn't heard from Stephen all weekend, which was actually normal, because at the time, Stephen was going through a rebellious phase. Stephen and his dad had gotten into a big argument after Stephen decided to drop out of high school, and lately, Stephen would leave home for days at a time without telling anyone where he was, and he would do the exact same thing when he was staying at his mother's house. But David knew, despite all that, Stephen had a good heart, and he wouldn't just ignore his parents' phone calls when they just wanted to know that he was safe. So David told Carissa he would try to get in touch with Stephen. So David hung up and then used his cell phone to call and text Stephen. He didn't get a response, and as the rain and wind picked up outside and the tornado sirens continued to blare, David started to worry. He told himself that, Stephen was probably at one of his friends' houses, but Stephen had buddies all over the city. What if he'd been visiting someone in South Joplin, in the tornado's path? But there really wasn't anything David could do. With the storm outside, David basically just had to stay home and wait it out before he went out looking for his son. 30 minutes later, David was glued to the news, and the meteorologist finally reported that the tornado in South Joplin had passed and it was now safe for people to go outside. David still had not been able to contact Stephen, so as soon as he heard the all clear, he grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. David planned to drive to the two hospitals in Joplin to check if Stephen was at either one. And as he drove, David felt a bit of relief seeing that his neighborhood was still in good shape. There was debris here and there, and a few thin trees had snapped in half, but nobody's houses or cars were severely damaged. However, David's relief turned to anxiety as he drove further south, where the tornado had actually touched down, and he saw the widespread devastation. To David, it looked like a giant had stomped right on top of the town. Houses were flattened into piles of wood and brick, power lines had collapsed, battered cars and trucks were littered all over the streets, creating roadblocks that were nearly impossible to pass. David turned on the car radio to see what the local news station was saying about the storm, and a reporter came on and said the tornado had been categorized as an EF5, which is the highest on the scale. Thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, hundreds of residents were injured, and dozens of people had already been found dead. David fought hard to keep his anxiety at bay, praying that Stephen had not been in this area when the tornado had come through. Finally, David reached St. John's Regional Medical Center, and he was horrified to see that the huge multi-story building had been decimated too. An entire side of the hospital was now gone, and David could see first responders running in and out of the building, hustling survivors out. And so David just turned and began driving toward Joplin's other hospital called Freeman Health System. As he pulled into the parking lot, David was relieved to see that Freeman was still standing. And so he parked his car in the lot and then ran inside. Entering Freeman Hospital was like walking into a nightmare. The emergency room was crowded with people who'd been injured, some quite badly. David saw one man who had a bloody, obviously broken leg, and there was a woman with shards of glass literally sticking out of her arms and chest. He could hear children crying and the muted sounds of an ambulance pulling up outside. And at least a dozen people were lined up in front of the reception desk, all new patients waiting to be checked in. David didn't want to waste valuable time waiting in that line, so he just started walking around the lobby asking random hospital employees if they'd seen a skinny 16-year-old boy with dark shaggy hair. But everyone he talked to said no. But just then, a doctor came out of the doors that led to the emergency room, and her blue scrubs were stained with blood, and she looked completely overwhelmed. But David just sprinted right up to her and asked her the same question. Hey, have you seen my son? He's 16, he's got scraggly hair, he's skinny, and he also has a big tattoo on his right forearm. When the doctor heard this, in particular the right forearm tattoo comment, the doctor's expression changed, and she told David to please follow her. And she led him through the chaotic hallway and into a room where a teenage boy was lying unconscious on a bed with a breathing tube inserted directly into the front of his neck. His face was so badly injured that David didn't actually recognize him. But then the doctor walked over to the boy and gently lifted up the boy's right arm and showed David the tattoo. and when David saw it, he knew immediately he'd found his son. The doctor said a good Samaritan had brought Stephen and one of his friends to the hospital, and Stephen apparently had been riding around with 2 other teenage boys when their car had been sucked up into the tornado. The other 2 teenagers were okay, but Stephen was not. He was in terrible shape. He had a serious head injury, several cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep open wound on his abdomen that left the right side of his rib cage totally exposed. But despite all his injuries, the doctor said that hospital staff had been able to stabilize him. And so right now, the doctor said he was doing basically as well as he could be, and they hoped he would just continue to improve. David was shocked and horrified and heartbroken to hear what his son had gone through, but the doctor at least sounded somewhat optimistic, which made David hopeful too. And so David thanked the doctor and then called Stephen's mother, Carissa, to tell her the bad news. 5 days later, Carissa sat beside her son's hospital bed, wishing that Stephen could talk to her. The doctors were keeping him in a medically induced coma so that his brain could heal from his traumatic head injury. But Carissa spoke to him anyway, telling him that she loved him and that he was strong. And she wanted to believe that her son could hear her because he did seem to be doing better. Some of Stephen's bruises were lightening up, and the smaller scrapes and cuts he had were starting to heal as well. But one side of his face was still covered in a thick scab, and Carissa had not yet dared to look beneath the huge white bandage that stretched from her son's belly button up to his right armpit. Carissa reached out to hold Stephen's hand, and she noticed that his fingers looked bigger than usual, like they were swollen. Carissa got up and walked to the other side of his bed, and she saw that his other hand looked swollen too. A few minutes later, when a nurse came in to check on Stephen, Carissa asked about Stephen's hands. The nurse looked closely and said the swelling in his hands might be caused by an infection inside of his body. The nurse did not seem that concerned, but she told Carissa she would ask the doctor to get Stephen started on a course of antibiotics right away, which should help his body fight off this infection. Carissa nodded and gave the nurse a weak smile like she was okay with this answer, but inside, she had no idea what kind of infection caused a person's hands to swell up so much. But the nurse did not seem like she had any time for questions. She was already rushing out of the room. Carissa knew the doctors and nurses were doing their best, but they were clearly overworked, and it worried her that they hadn't noticed these signs of Stephen's potential infection. But Carissa just felt glad that she was at least there to look after her son and make sure his medical team didn't miss anything. And so she and David agreed to coordinate their schedules so that at least one of them was always by Stephen's side. On June 1st, so 3 days after Stephen's antibiotic treatment began, Carissa and David were sitting beside each other on the small couch in Stephen's room when a doctor walked in. He had a grave expression on his face as he told the parents that the antibiotics did not seem to be working. In fact, the swelling in Stephen's hands had only gotten worse. And now he was also running a fever, and his blood pressure kept jumping and then plummeting. The doctor said that with every passing hour, Stephen's condition was getting less and less stable. And the doctor admitted that the hospital didn't have the resources to take care of Stephen at the moment. They were struggling just to find beds for all the patients who'd been injured during the tornado. The doctor said that what Stephen really needed was a team of doctors who had the time and space to care for him properly. So they suggested having Stephen airlifted 150 miles north to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. The doctor promised Stephen would get better, more specialized care there than he could in Joplin. For the parents, this was not even a question. Of course, they would take Stephen wherever he needed to go to get better. So just a few minutes later, Carissa watched as medical staff loaded her still unconscious son into a medical helicopter, and then David jumped in after him and gave Carissa a hesitant wave goodbye. Carissa backed away and watched as the helicopter took off and began its journey, and then Carissa headed out to the parking lot, got into her car, and began the long drive north to Kansas City. That same afternoon, at the Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a pediatric infectious disease specialist named Dr. Marianne Jackson stepped into the room where her newest patient had just arrived. Dr. Jackson, who was a very energetic woman, had decades of experience treating children with unidentified infections, which made her the perfect person to take care of Stephen. She'd already been briefed on his condition, so when she went into his room, she was not surprised to see him laying there unconscious with a breathing tube down his throat. Dr. Jackson introduced herself to Stephen's father, who was in the room, and she explained that she was here to figure out what was causing his son's hands to swell up. And then Dr. Jackson walked over to Stephen and looked at his hands, which were definitely still very swollen, but she couldn't see any open wounds on his hands or wrists where an infection could develop. And so Dr. Jackson began to check out the rest of Stephen's injuries. The scabs on his face were healing well, and so too were the cuts and bruises on his arms and legs. That just left Stephen's biggest wound, the one on his abdomen, which was currently covered by a huge white bandage. Dr. Jackson carefully removed that bandage, and even though the doctors from Freeman Health System had warned her about the severity of Stephen's injury, she still was not prepared for what she saw. His entire side was exposed. The skin, fat, and muscle that would normally protect his ribcage had all been ripped away. And then Dr. Jackson noticed that sort of surrounding this horrible wound on his abdomen was this weird, shiny black material that almost looked like patent leather. Dr. Jackson recognized this as dead tissue. Whatever infection Stephen had, it was causing the skin and muscle around the wound to die and turn black. Dr. Jackson knew that this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Dead tissue can be a breeding ground for all kinds of dangerous bacteria, plus it stops wounds from healing properly. Dr. Jackson explained to Stephen's father they would need to bring his son in for surgery immediately. All of that dead black tissue around Stephen's wound would need to be surgically removed as soon as possible. David looked uneasy, but he said, "Okay, whatever you have to do." And then he squeezed his son's hand and told him that he was strong and he was going to be okay. And then a nurse came in and wheeled Stephen away to be prepped for surgery. That evening, in the operating room, Dr. Jackson watched as a surgeon carefully removed sections of the thick black tissue from around Stephen's chest wound. The surgeon cut away as much dead tissue as he could find, but what was left behind didn't look very healthy either. Dr. Jackson could already tell that Stephen was almost certainly going to need another operation after this one. And so after the surgeon was done and began putting a fresh bandage over Stephen's chest, Dr. Jackson took samples of the dead tissue they'd removed and sent them to the hospital lab for analysis. 2 days later, Dr. Jackson was back in the operating room, standing next to the surgeon as he held a scalpel close to Stephen's chest. They had not received the results of tissue analysis from the lab yet, but when Dr. Jackson checked in on Stephen that morning, she realized she had been right. He definitely needed more surgery. Because not only was there more dying and blackened tissue surrounding Stephen's wound, but something even more disturbing was happening. Something that Dr. Jackson had never seen in over 25 years of practicing medicine. Looking down at Stephen's exposed ribs, Dr. Jackson and the surgeon both saw fuzzy black material growing on top of Stephen's bones and into his muscles. Dr. Jackson turned to the surgeon and said it sort of looked like mold. And so whatever infection Stephen had, it was clearly eating away at his flesh and also spreading throughout his chest cavity. And even though Stephen was on huge doses of antibiotics, this infection kept on growing at an alarming rate. Dr. Jackson watched as the surgeon carved away as much of the mold and dead tissue as he could. But still, Dr. Jackson knew this was not sustainable. With each surgery, they were chopping off more and more of Stephen's skin and muscle. And so they couldn't just keep doing that because that would eventually kill him. Plus, this infection appeared to just grow back anyway. But regardless, when the surgeon was finished and Stephen went back to the recovery room, Dr. Jackson briefed his parents about what she and the surgeon had found. She still didn't know what this infection was, but it was clearly very aggressive and was not responding to any of the medications the doctors had tried so far. Dr. Jackson swore she was going to do everything she possibly could to help their son, but she admitted it was going to take a miracle for their son to pull through this. David looked at the doctor with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't understand how this was happening. One moment, Stephen was a perfectly healthy kid. The next, he was injured in this freak tornado accident. And now his body was being ravaged by some kind of mysterious flesh-eating infection, and nobody could tell them what it was, how he got it, or how to help him. It just didn't make any sense. 10 days later, Dr. Jackson arrived for her shift at the hospital. She pulled on her white coat and walked down the hallway towards Stephen's room to check on him. But she was not feeling optimistic. Ever since Stephen's second surgery, his condition had just kept on getting worse. The tissue surrounding his wound was slowly dying, and as hard as the hospital staff had tried to keep his wounds clean, that fuzzy black mold just kept coming back. But just before she got to Stephen's room, a lab technician stopped her in the hallway and told her they'd finally gotten the results of Stephen's tissue analysis. This lab report did explain what was causing Stephen's life-threatening infection. And while Dr. Jackson was glad to finally have some answers, she knew that this diagnosis was not good news. The rare infection that was ravaging Stephen's body had less than a 20% survival rate, and the only treatment was absolutely brutal. Surgeons would need to cut every last bit of the infection out of his body. And so just a few hours later, Dr. Jackson was once again in the operating room with the same surgeon who had performed Stephen's first 2 surgeries. And as the surgeon sliced away mold and dead tissue, he suddenly turned to Dr. Jackson with a horrified expression on his face. Now, the mold was not just on Stephen's bones and in his muscles. Mold had also made its way into Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. In order to get this infection out of Stephen's body, the surgeon was going to have to remove parts of Stephen's vital organs. Dr. Jackson told the surgeon that they just didn't have any other choice. Stephen might die if he lost parts of these organs, but he would definitely die if the surgeon left any trace of the infection behind. So, the surgeon very carefully began to cut away moldy sections of Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. And when the surgery was over, Stephen had lost so much bodily tissue that Dr. Jackson could literally see his internal organs through the gaps in his ribs. She could see his lungs inflate and could see what was left of his heart still beating. And so even though Dr. Jackson wanted to remain optimistic, looking down at the mangled boy, she just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive this. 8 weeks later, in August of 2011, Stephen's mom, Carissa, was curled up on the fold-out bed in Stephen's hospital room, trying her best to relax. She had stayed there almost every night that summer, but she rarely got any sleep. Even after the doctors had removed parts of Stephen's vital organs, the infection kept coming back. And so Stephen had undergone 12 more surgeries to remove mold and dead tissue from inside of his chest, and then a few days after Stephen's most recent surgery, Dr. Jackson had roused Carissa to tell her that for the first time, the mold had not come back. They had finally cured Stephen's infection. At first, Carissa wanted to celebrate, but then reality came crashing down on her. As doctors worked hard to save Stephen's life, his body had been damaged almost beyond repair. Despite this infection being gone, he might never wake up from his coma. And even if he did, at a minimum, he was going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries and years of physical therapy. And so that evening, thoughts about her son's uncertain future kept Carissa wide awake as usual. And so, needing a distraction, Carissa sat up, grabbed the TV remote, and flipped through the channels until she found MTV, Stephen's favorite channel. And then she sat upright on the hard fold-out bed and reached over to hold her son's hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw Stephen move. Carissa turned her head and looked at Stephen, and she saw that she was not mistaken. Stephen was blinking. His eyes were now wide open. For the first time since the tornado nearly 3 months ago, her son was awake. Stephen looked around the room, confused about where he was and what was happening, and then a moment later, he looked right at his mom, and she burst out laughing and crying at the same time, totally overcome with joy. The following morning, Dr. Jackson stood next to Stephen's hospital bed. Stephen's parents were both in the room, and they both looked happier and more energized than they had in months. Although Dr. Jackson had been treating Stephen since June, this was the first time she was really meeting him, and the shaggy-haired teenager had a lot of questions for her. He said that the last thing that he could remember was tumbling out of his friend's car and being pulled up into the tornado. He had no idea what happened after that. Dr. Jackson told him that the fact that he was alive was a miracle. She explained how terribly injured he'd been after the tornado, but that wasn't even the worst of it. After being hurt, he'd developed this infection that ate away at his skin, muscles, and organs, and very nearly killed him. This incredibly rare infection was called zygomycosis, and it was caused by a fungus that had invaded Stephen's body. The fungus blocked off his blood vessels, causing his skin and muscle tissue to die and rot. At the same time, it grew rapidly inside of his body, appearing as black mold on his ribs and in his muscles and organs. This fungus usually lives in water or underground, and it doesn't normally make people sick. However, during the devastating tornado, which killed over 150 people and injured thousands of others, this fungus had been swept up into the vortex. And after Stephen's chest was cut wide open, that fungus that was in the tornado was literally blown into his chest cavity, where it took hold and began multiplying quickly. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 12 other people who were affected by this tornado had also developed the same horrible infection as Stephen because they had open wounds and the fungus was blown inside of them. But Dr. Jackson actually told Stephen that compared to some of the other victims, he was one of the lucky ones. 5 of those 12 other people affected by this fungus had died. Stephen had to spend another 3 months in the hospital before he was healthy enough to go home. Even then, he underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and was left with a giant scar stretching from his belly button almost to his neck. But much like the tattoo he got when he was 16, Stephen feels like his huge tornado scar is an important part of his story because it shows how far he's come. After his battle with deadly fungal infection, Stephen decided to go back to school and finish his education. And today, he's a proud father to 4 young kids, and he couldn't be happier. Although, from time to time, he still has nightmares about the tornado that changed his life. Reggie Cole was just a child when his family moved from Louisiana to an area of Los Angeles, California called South Central. When the Coles arrived in 1985, South Central, which had a population of 500,000 people, was seeing a huge uptick in gang violence and drug dealing. But by the time Reggie, the youngest of the 5 Cole children, had turned 10 years old, the family had managed to move from an apartment on 98th Street in one of the most dangerous areas of South Central to 71st Street, one of the few somewhat safe neighborhoods in the area. They lived in a small tan bungalow that had a neat front yard that was bordered by rose bushes and shaded by palm and eucalyptus trees. Reggie's mother was a deeply religious woman. She made sure all of her children attended the local Missionary Baptist church every Sunday. She was also strict and told her 2 daughters and 3 sons that they had to be inside the house every night before the streetlights came on. Reggie's stepfather, who had raised the Cole kids as if they were his own, worked in an aluminum factory. He was from a small town in Louisiana, and in their new South Central neighborhood, he became known for his soul food. On Sundays, the Cole children always looked forward to a big meal of red beans, rice, black-eyed peas, and collards. But for one of the Cole children, the middle son named Kenny, home was not on 71st Street. For him, home was the old neighborhood where the family had lived on 98th Street, where Kenny was part of a violent gang called 9 Deuce Hoover Crips. And when Kenny was 15 and Reggie was 10, Kenny was killed in that old neighborhood in a drive-by shooting. His killer was never caught. Reggie was devastated. Always small and skinny, he had idolized his older brother, and Kenny had always protected Reggie from neighborhood bullies. For a while after the murder of his brother, Reggie continued to do well in school. He got good marks in junior high and joined his other brother as an usher in church on Sundays, and he kept up with school social events, playing basketball and attending his junior high prom. But by the time Reggie was 2 years into high school, all that had changed. Reggie, who had inherited his deceased brother's friends and gang affiliations from the old neighborhood, was gradually sinking deeper and deeper into gang life. Because of his goofy attitude, Reggie became known to his brother's friends as Gumby. Although he still lived at home with his mom, Reggie had moved out of her house and into a shed in her backyard. His family called him Reggie, but now he preferred his street name, Gumby. And he'd started dressing down, which meant wearing the oversized jogging suits and sports apparel and expensive sneakers that marked him as a gang member. Then, in his senior year, he dropped out of high school, and at the same time, his mom and stepfather separated. Once he was out of school, Reggie spent all of his time on the streets, or in his shed, where the walls were covered with gang graffiti and where he now grew 2 marijuana plants right outside the shed door. The gulf between Reggie's life and that of his siblings and mother also continued to grow. One of Reggie's older sisters was a bus driver and a choir director at the Missionary Baptist Church. His other sister had just enrolled in college, and Reggie's older brother was a hospital equipment operator. Reggie's brother-in-law had offered him work in his plumbing business, but Reggie wasn't interested. He always drifted back to his gang in the old neighborhood. So it was a huge disappointment to his mom, but not exactly unexpected, when Reggie, at the age of 16, had his first arrest after failing to stop for a police officer, and his second arrest later that same year for getting caught carrying a weapon. A year after that, in 1993, when Reggie was 17, the homicide rate in South Central had skyrocketed to the point where 7 people were being killed there every week. And Reggie was at ground zero for all of that street violence, selling crack at motels along the Figueroa corridor. Running 30 miles north and south through the city, Figueroa is one of the longest streets in Los Angeles, and today it has the highest arrest rate in the city for prostitution. Finally, in 1995, when Reggie was 19, his gang affiliations and his criminal behavior caught up with him. On August 1st of that year, Reggie was found guilty of fatally shooting a man who was standing outside of a known prostitution house on Figueroa Street. Reggie was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Immediately after the sentence was read, Reggie was placed in a holding cell at a county supermax facility in South Central until a prison transport bus could take him to his new home 3.5 hours away in Imperial County. That new home was Calipatria State Prison, one of the most violent maximum security prisons in the California correctional system. A few days later, on the day Reggie was set to leave for Calipatria, he was thin and lanky, standing at almost 6 feet tall, but weighing just 140 pounds. He was also still wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd been wearing in county jail. Only now, as he climbed onto the prison transport bus in leg and ankle chains, the orange suit marked him as a brand new prisoner, or fresh fish, in the eyes of the level 4 offenders he would be spending the rest of his life with in Calipatria. As the bus headed east from the county jail in Los Angeles and crossed from the heart of the city into the desert, Reggie began to realize just how bad his situation really was. He was not just traveling to a new jail, he was leaving behind everyone and everything he had ever known. About 3 hours later, while looking out the window of the bus, Reggie got his first glimpse of Calipatria Prison off in the distance. Its sprawling 325-acre complex of fences, towers, exercise pens, and 2-story cell blocks sat in the middle of more than 1,200 acres of sandy, desolate no-man's land. As Reggie sat there staring, he suddenly realized he was soaked with sweat, despite the fact that the bus was running its air conditioning on full blast. But Reggie had no idea how comfortable that bus ride was relative to where he was going. In Calipatria Prison, when inmates were sent outside to the asphalt-covered exercise yard, there was almost no shade, and temperatures routinely reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the height of summer, temperatures could reach as high as 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And winters in Calipatria were actually just as bad as the summers, but for the opposite reason. During those months, temperatures would plunge well below freezing at night. As the bus rambled down the road, getting closer and closer to Calipatria, Reggie started to smell the cow manure from the cattle feedlots they were passing by. Reggie bent his head down toward his shackled hands to try to cover his nose, not realizing that there was absolutely no getting away from that smell. It would literally permeate every inch of his new home. Finally, the bus reached the prison. Before entering the prison grounds, the bus had to pass through a heavily guarded and fortified opening in a 13-foot-high electric fence topped with razor wire that outlined the perimeter of the maximum security area of Calipatria. The purpose of this fence, which had enough voltage in it to instantly kill anyone who touched it, was to cut down on prison escapes, and to allow correctional officers, who were outnumbered more than 50 to 1 by prisoners, to move from guarding the perimeter to patrolling the inside of the prison. However, this shift in manpower had done very little to stop the violence inside the prison. There was hardly anyone in California, including Reggie, who hadn't heard news reports about the horrible attack that had happened in Calipatria 3 months earlier. 5 inmates armed with homemade knives stabbed and beat 8 prison guards. None of the guards died, but the incident sent shockwaves through the state. After passing through the perimeter fence, Reggie's bus continued on towards the main prison. As they got closer, Reggie suddenly felt scared and wished the bus ride could go on for a little bit longer so he wouldn't have to get off. The bus finally reached a large garage just off of one of the main buildings. When the bus pulled into the garage, the inmates saw several guards standing around inside, clearly waiting for them. And behind these guards on the wall was a big security door that led into the prison. It actually went into an area called Receiving and Discharge, or R&D. R&D is where new inmates are cataloged, inventoried, and booked into the prison system and their specific prison facility. The bus driver pulled into the designated parking spot in the garage and then came to a complete stop. As the bus engine idled and Reggie and all of the other fresh fish sat anxiously on the bus, one of the guards outside, who was carrying a clipboard, stepped onto the bus and chatted with the driver for a moment. Then the guard turned and faced Reggie and the other men on board and started calling out their names one by one. As he did, each man got up and, with their hands and feet in shackles, they shuffled to the back of the bus, where another guard had opened the back door. There, they would walk down 2 steps to the garage floor. The guard at the back of the bus would then yell at them to make their way over to the door that led into R&D, and there, standing outside that door, were several more guards, all armed with pepper spray and batons, who would pat each man down and search them. After the men were searched, they were motioned to walk through the door into R&D. Although the chains and shackles he was wearing had already drilled into Reggie the fact that his life was now totally changed, he was still not prepared for the shock he felt when he finally stepped through the R&D door and was actually inside the prison. Inside, a guard watched every move Reggie made, and security glass and wire separated Reggie from the men and women who processed his paperwork. What little he had brought with him was about to be inventoried and put into a storage compartment. His only possessions going forward would be the items that prison officials would give him over the next several hours. After stepping into a big windowless room, he was told to take off his clothes, and then a guard with gloves on did the first of hundreds of strip searches that would become a routine part of Reggie's life. Then he was handed his prison-issue clothing and told to get dressed. After he was given his inmate ID card that he would keep with him at all times. Reggie was also given 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a washcloth, a pillowcase, soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. After leaving R&D, Reggie was walked to his cell. In Calipatria, the cell blocks were all 2 stories high, with each cell door facing out toward a common area that the guards patrolled. Unlike what most people imagine when they think of jail cells, these cells did not have bars with lots of openings to look through. The cell walls were concrete, with no windows, and the doors were heavy sheet metal with only 2 small vertical slits that were windows that they could look through out into the common area. Inside of Calipatria, every sound reverberated off of the concrete and metal, meaning it was always noisy and extremely difficult to sleep. As Reggie was led by the guard to his cell, the awful sounds echoing all around of people yelling and banging on things were so distracting and awful that his initial impulse was just to run away to somewhere that was quiet. But, of course, as soon as he had that impulse, he remembered that he'll never be able to do that, ever. This was his reality. When Reggie finally entered his single-person cell and heard the door shut behind him, he felt himself relax just a little bit. He looked around his tiny room and saw a metal sink and a toilet, as well as a bunk bed. And as he looked at the bunk bed, it took him a second to process that there was another person laying on it. Although Calipatria had only opened 3 years earlier in 1992, by the time Reggie arrived, it was already completely overcrowded, which is why single-person cells like this one now held 2 people. The man laying in the bottom bunk stared at Reggie. Reggie looked away. He knew better than to try to be friends with this man. Keeping his head down and making sure he did not touch the lower bunk where his cellmate was still watching him, Reggie awkwardly made up the top bunk with the sheet and blankets he'd been given in R&D. Then, once his bed was made, Reggie walked a few feet over to the metal toilet. He did his business. Then, without a word, he hauled himself up onto the top bunk, where he lay staring at the ceiling in silence. Within the first few weeks of Reggie's arrival, he was given his first lesson in prison survival. He was out in the exercise yard when an older inmate who was sitting on top of one of the picnic tables motioned Reggie over. With his elbows propped on his knees, the inmates stared at Reggie as if sizing him up. Then he told Reggie, "You need to find people from your neighborhood, and then you need to join one of the gangs, and if possible, you join the same gang that you ran with on the outside. And don't trust anyone. No one here is your friend. Oh, and make yourself a knife." Reggie thanked him and decided he would take his advice. Inside the prison, Reggie began scanning the inmates for tattoos that signified they were in the Crips, like he had been when he was still a free man. Outside in the yard, Reggie continued to scan the inmates, but he kept to the perimeter where he couldn't be seen as disrespecting anyone or invading their space. Reggie also always carried a homemade knife, which was a toothbrush he had filed down against the concrete. But before Reggie was invited to join a gang, which would offer him protection, he was challenged. Reggie had been making his usual perimeter walk out in the yard when a bigger inmate and a few of his crew walked over and stood in front of Reggie, blocking his path. Then the main guy started muscling Reggie against the fence. Reggie already knew what happened to Fresh Fish, who did not stand up to the first sign of any kind of disrespect or aggression. In fact, he'd seen it over and over again right in his own cell. His cellmate, the same one who had been laying on the bottom bunk when Reggie first arrived, had made the mistake of thinking a few visitors to their cell, men neither of them knew, were there as friends. His cellmate had welcomed them inside and shook hands with them, while Reggie had remained on the top bunk and pretended to be asleep. The men who had come inside immediately grabbed Reggie's cellmate, threw him on the ground, and raped him. When they were done, they left without touching Reggie. Because Reggie's cellmate had not fought back during this first assault, these men would come back many more times, and each time Reggie would be forced to listen to it while he lay still and silent in his top bunk. And like most of the inmate-on-inmate attacks at this prison, the rapes went unreported. Even if a guard took a charge like that seriously, the consequences of snitching on another inmate were much worse than any punishment a correctional guard could deal out. So, out in the yard, as Reggie found himself being muscled against the fence by this big guy, the thought of his cellmate being raped over and over again ran through Reggie's mind. He knew he had to stand up for himself. So Reggie reached into his waistband, he grabbed his homemade knife, and he stabbed the bigger inmate in the side. His aim was not to deliver a wound that would kill, or be so serious that the guards would have to investigate, but to use his weapon for defense and intimidation. From that day forward, while Reggie would never be known as a brawler, he did start to build a reputation as someone who was quick to use his blade, and therefore someone who was not to be messed with. Shortly after this stabbing, Reggie was welcomed into a gang called the 49 Deuce Crips. All the Crips at Calipatria were run by a single man, one of the most violent inmates there, a 200-pound bodybuilder named Eddie Clark, who went by the nickname El Diablo, or the Devil. For El Diablo, Calipatria was not just his home, it was his business. Calipatria was known as a money prison, where drugs were just as pervasive as unchecked violence. Reggie had seen dozens of inmates smuggle crack and heroin around the prison. They would put the drugs inside balloons before inserting them into their bodies, a practice that was extremely risky because the balloon could break or disintegrate once it was inside of them. And all this was part of the drug empire that was ruled by El Diablo. Even the guards recognized his power as Calipatria's shot caller, allowing him to wear a bright orange do-rag wrapped around his head out in the prison yard. Under the general protection of his new gang and their leader, El Diablo, Reggie's life got noticeably better. Not only was he now much more safe at the prison, but being a part of this gang also allowed Reggie to feel somewhat human again. Whether it was playing basketball or leaning up against the picnic tables and chatting with fellow gang members, Reggie finally had people around him that he felt like he could trust. But, like everyone else in the Deuce Crips, Reggie did his best not to interact with or attract any attention from El Diablo. Because even though El Diablo was their boss and main protector, they were all afraid of him. El Diablo was only 34 years old, but he had spent 20 of those years behind bars. When he was a juvenile, he beat another teenager to death. When he was an adult, he sexually assaulted an elderly woman and shot her son in the course of robbing their house. In prison, El Diablo was known to turn on people, even his own people, suddenly, viciously, and without warning. The devil was also connected to prison staff. 2 years after he'd entered prison, he'd fallen in love with one of the corrections officers who oversaw one of the common areas where the devil spent time. He wrote her an 8-page-long love letter where he told her that, quote, she had 75% of his heart. This was apparently enough for Lisa Finch, who eventually quit her job as a prison guard, married El Diablo, and on her visits to him in Calipatria, she smuggled in PCP-laced cigarettes that he could sell to other inmates. Over the next 4 years, Reggie carved out a relatively safe life for himself in Calipatria. He had managed to fit in with his new gang without upsetting El Diablo. He also managed to avoid making any real enemies outside of his gang. Over the course of those 4 years, Reggie spent much of his time exercising, which added some muscle to his thin frame. He also got several tattoos, including a Ghetto Star prison tattoo on his shoulders, as well as 2 Crips tattoos on his chest and stomach. But despite settling into a routine and starting to feel relatively comfortable, Reggie knew he and everyone else at that prison had a big problem. By 2000, so 5 years into Reggie's prison sentence, El Diablo had gone from just being a very intimidating inmate to being a monster. He would attack virtually anyone for virtually anything. Sometimes all it took was looking at him wrong to get stabbed or beaten or raped. This, of course, made life inside of the prison even more precarious than it already was, as no one knew who El Diablo's next target was going to be. By the fall of 2000, the devil, who was now manufacturing alcohol from the fruit juice he stole from the prison kitchens, had developed such a substance abuse problem that some of his own fellow gang members had tried, unsuccessfully, to stage an intervention. As one inmate recalled, when he was drunk, he was an animal. If he raped you, nobody was going to say anything. But it would turn out that out of all the violent and dangerous offenders in Calipatria who might have stood up to El Diablo and challenged his authority, it would be Reggie, one of the least ruthless inmates, who would finally do it. In late October of that year, an inmate using a slingshot fired a homemade dart at one of the corrections officers out in the prison yard. The dart missed and stuck into a gate post instead. Immediately, the guards ordered all the inmates to lay on the ground so they could do a weapons check to see who had thrown the dart. The guards didn't discover who had thrown it. However, during their search, they did find a homemade knife inside of a cotton glove laying out in the grass. The guards didn't know this, but the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was one of El Diablo's most trusted lieutenants. And so as the guards picked up the knife and began asking whose it was, every inmate in the yard knew El Diablo was going to do something to protect his cellmate from getting caught. El Diablo's eyes traveled across the yard and came to a stop on Reggie Cole, who just happened to be out on work assignment painting one of the prison walls that faced into the yard. Reggie was already serving a life sentence without parole, so adding a weapons charge wouldn't actually change his sentence. Paintbrush in hand, Reggie held his breath, but even with his eyes down, he could feel El Diablo's sudden attention and the silence that filled the yard. Reggie looked up and saw the devil staring right at him. Then El Diablo made a single motion with his hand, pointing to the knife in the corrections officer's hand. He might as well have shouted his order. You, Reggie, you take the blame for this. For just a moment, Reggie's mind went blank. Then he saw in his mind what would happen if he agreed to do this for the devil. He might be sent to solitary confinement. He might have his family visitation rights revoked. And he would be publicly submitting to another inmate, which would make him look weak. And if he agreed to submit this one time, then he'd likely spend the rest of his life at Calipatria under the thumb of other inmates. So with El Diablo staring at him expectantly, Reggie paused and then said the words that changed the course of his and El Diablo's life. No, not my knife, Reggie said. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the corrections officers looked stunned. Reggie did not look at El Diablo, but both men knew at that moment Reggie was now a marked man. El Diablo would make sure that Reggie paid the highest price possible for refusing this direct order. Over the next 4 weeks, Reggie expected to be attacked by El Diablo or one of his henchmen at any moment. As the nights grew colder, Reggie would lie in his bunk, sleepless, thinking about his options. The way he saw it, there were only 4 of them. He could submit to El Diablo and do whatever he wanted to pay for his insubordination. He could snitch on El Diablo to the guards. He could kill El Diablo, or he could be killed by El Diablo. Reggie obsessed over these 4 choices. He'd pace around the perimeter of the exercise yard, keeping a very wide berth around El Diablo, weighing out the pros and cons of each action. Finally, Reggie made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but he knew he'd be ready when the time was right. It all happened on the morning of November 28, 2000, roughly 1 month after Reggie had refused to take the blame for the knife. That day, Reggie was walking around the perimeter of the exercise yard when he noticed the devil walking toward him. The devil wasn't even trying to sneak up on Reggie. It seemed like he wanted Reggie to know that he was about to get attacked. Reggie stopped and just watched the devil as he got closer, not really sure what he should do. When the devil was finally right in front of him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand, and then with his right, he drove a knife into Reggie's side. Not far enough to be a lethal blow, but enough to send a very painful message that Reggie's days were numbered. As he pulled the knife out of Reggie, El Diablo leaned forward and whispered into Reggie's ear, "You are my bitch." And then he chucked the knife onto the grass and casually walked away. Reggie pressed his hand over his wound, he gritted his teeth, and he walked in the opposite direction of El Diablo over towards the fence. There was nothing anyone could do for him. The guards made no sign of having even noticed the attack, and even if they had, Reggie, like other victims of El Diablo's violence, would have lied. About 15 minutes later, a bell sounded, signaling the exercise period was over. The guards and inmates knew the drill. The inmates would line up and be searched for weapons or contraband before they were allowed to re-enter the cell blocks. El Diablo was ahead of Reggie in the line. Reggie, hiding his stab wound under the waistband of his pants, stood there quietly, clutching a 6-inch-long knife that he had dug out of its hiding place near the fence just minutes after he had been attacked by El Diablo. A corrections officer ordered El Diablo to turn around while he was still in line and to stretch out his arms so he could be searched. The devil did this, and as he was turned around, he stared menacingly at Reggie. On the devil's right forearm, there was a tattoo of a hand gripping a sword. On his right ribcage was a self-portrait of El Diablo slitting a man's throat. Looking up and finally meeting El Diablo's eyes, Reggie suddenly leapt over the crouched prison guard who was between them searching El Diablo, and Reggie drove the point of his homemade knife directly into the front of El Diablo's throat. El Diablo, still staring at Reggie, but now with a look of terror on his face, staggered backwards and off to the side. The blade had gone straight through his voice box, and blood was now pouring out of that 1-inch hole in the center of his neck. Reggie immediately threw himself to the ground, putting his hands behind his back. As he laid there looking up at the stunned El Diablo, Reggie knew the wound he had just inflicted was fatal. As everyone else in the yard also got down on the ground and guards started firing off their cans of pepper spray, Reggie told one of the nearby guards, "I know what I did. I know what I did." By the time the doctor arrived 30 minutes later, El Diablo was dead. By late that afternoon, Reggie had been placed into solitary confinement. Other inmates may have hated and feared El Diablo, but by killing Calapatria's shot caller, El Diablo's lieutenants would be gunning for Reggie. Not only that, Reggie now faced another murder charge. If he was convicted, the only punishment left was the death penalty. And no one contested the fact that Reggie had committed this murder. There had been dozens of eyewitnesses, including prison guards, who had seen Reggie fatally stab El Diablo. Also, there was security camera footage, and there was Reggie's own confession, one that he never tried to recant. Instead, Reggie actually went on record saying that he felt bad for killing El Diablo because El Diablo was a human being who had a family that was going to hurt when they heard the news. But Reggie also insisted that he murdered El Diablo in self-defense. If a judge accepted this, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped to manslaughter and Reggie would escape the death penalty, but he would still face 10 years in solitary confinement. Both outcomes seemed so grim that even to Reggie, hiring a lawyer and preparing a defense seemed both hopeless and pointless. When Reggie was handed a list of county-approved attorneys, he looked at it, but none of the names meant anything to him. However, it would turn out that Reggie's random choice of a lawyer named Christopher Plord would be the second most important decision of his life, right after his decision to kill El Diablo. Because over the course of the next 3 years, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, dressed in his crumpled suits and peering out from behind his wire-rimmed glasses, would make a huge discovery about Reggie that would change everything. And the way Christopher made that discovery was by digging into the murder case that had landed Reggie in Calipatria in the first place. 6 years before the murder of El Diablo, late on the night of Monday, March 28, 1994, 2 LAPD homicide detectives arrived at the scene of a murder. It was right outside of a known house of prostitution on Figueroa Street, the street in South Central that Reggie used to spend a lot of his time on. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez Angeles. He was found lying on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police located the prostitution house manager, a pimp named John Jones, who also became their star eyewitness. According to John, who saw the attack from the second-floor window of the house, he said Felipe showed up to the house that night in a car with 2 other men. Felipe had gotten out, he had walked up to the door and knocked loudly. When one of John's staff members had opened the door, Felipe had asked to see a specific prostitute, but he was told she was busy. So Felipe turned around and started walking back toward the car where his other 2 friends were. But before he could get to the car, 3 teenagers, 2 of which had guns, appeared out of the darkness and demanded Felipe give them his money. They also yelled at Felipe's 2 friends who were in the car to do the same thing. But Felipe and his friends didn't speak English and just stood there seeming confused. At which point, the teenagers just started shooting at Felipe and his friends in the car. Felipe got hit in the back as he tried to flee, and his friends, they sped off in the car. The teenagers turned and ran down an alley, but before they disappeared, John said he noticed one of them was limping. John figured in the chaos, this teen had gotten accidentally shot in the leg by his own friend or even by himself potentially. A few weeks after the murder, a tip from police working a different crime altogether would lead those 2 LAPD detectives who arrived at Felipe's murder scene to Reggie Cole and his friend and fellow Crip, Obie Anthony, who were both in jail at the time on charges of suspected carjacking. One of the 2 detectives brought Reggie into an interrogation room, and during the questioning, the detective examined Reggie's legs, and very quickly he found a gunshot wound. Based on the presence of this gunshot wound on Reggie's leg and the eyewitness testimony of the pimp, John Jones, Reggie and Obie were both found guilty of murdering Felipe Angeles, and they both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. But looking at that case 6 years later, with his client, Reggie, in solitary confinement facing yet another murder charge, all Christopher Plord saw were some very big cracks in the LAPD investigation. Over the next 3 years, Christopher unearthed forensic evidence showing that the bullet that killed Felipe had not been fired from street level, but rather from above, maybe even from the roof or from John Jones's own apartment window. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Reggie's or Obie's, and no witness could ever identify Reggie as the shooter. John Jones himself had retracted his own testimony, saying that he had told the cops what they wanted to hear in exchange for a lighter sentence when it came to his own crime of running a prostitution house. But by far, the most surprising and damning discovery Christopher made about Reggie's case had to do with the wound on Reggie's leg. It was indeed a gunshot wound. However, it was not anywhere near recent. It was the result of an accident that had happened to Reggie when he was 13 years old, 5 years prior to the murder of Felipe Angeles. And when the LAPD detectives saw this wound in the interrogation room, they would have known it could not possibly have happened recently. It was just a big scar. And Reggie clearly wasn't affected by it. He was not limping at all. In addition to the extremely flimsy case against Reggie for that murder charge, another factor that enhanced the likelihood that Reggie was innocent was Reggie's own behavior after getting convicted. In Calipatria, where violence was power and inmates proudly talked about being killers, Reggie was one of the only inmates who insisted he was not a killer, that he was innocent of his crime. and whenever he wasn't in his cell or working or exercising in the yard, he was spending hours in the prison law library researching wrongful convictions. In February 2008, after Reggie had spent 14 years in prison, 8 of those years in solitary confinement, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, took Reggie's original murder case back to court. And this time, the judge decided that Reggie was innocent, that he had been wrongfully convicted. Following that decision, the state prosecutor agreed to drop the capital murder charge against Reggie in the death of El Diablo. Instead, he reduced the charge to 10 years in solitary confinement for manslaughter, agreeing that in killing El Diablo, Reggie had acted in self-defense. By the time that ruling came down, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary, which were counted towards his 10-year solitary sentence. So, 2 long years later, on May 15, 2009, Reggie Cole finished his solitary confinement sentence and walked out of Calipatria State Prison. He was a free man once again. But Reggie was hardly a happy man. Wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, Reggie was only cleared and made free again because of a murder he did commit, and this haunts him. After Reggie's friend, Obie Anthony, was also determined to have been wrongfully convicted, he too was released. In October 2012, the city of Los Angeles paid $8.3 million to Obie Anthony, and in January 2017, it paid $5.2 million to Reggie Cole. In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks, and so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground, but even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike, or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband, she brings James back and he looks inside, he's just as shocked as she is, and the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway, and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her, and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so she went back to her room thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed slam the door, you got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, "You're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it." But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James, and before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying. And Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally, she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced. And she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything is fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, "The front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them." But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, "You are totally overreacting. You're being paranoid. You're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house." And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, "You stay right here." And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. "I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep." And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, "You gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening." And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is probably just another ad for cheap cigarettes for my pet dolphin. But no, it's not, don't worry. This ad is for all my good, honest, hardworking people that just want to kick back and relax and purchase a high-quality rabid turtle to send to the like button without being interrupted by disgusting pesky pop-up ads. If you're living this pop-up nightmare right now, then today is your lucky day, because NordVPN exists. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all your data remains behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature, Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting pop-up ads that have been destroying your opportunity to buy a quality rab turret. NordVPN's Threat Protection will also protect you from malicious sites, trackers, and downloads. So, you can either go waste your money on any of the hundreds of so-called deals out there for cheap dolphin cigarettes, as if that exists, or you can be a big dog, sign up for NordVPN, and buy an infinite number of quality rab turrets without interruption. Talk about a no-brainer. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus an additional month free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over and they noticed that maybe I saw them and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was gonna bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay, but the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because, at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, and the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house,"
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property staring directly at James, unblinking. And then a couple of minutes later, the police would show up and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom. And then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death. Allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But Technically, the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called omnivore trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown. I don't know about you, but I am far more interested in mysteries that have occurred in the relatively recent past. I think it's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? You know, and also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved and being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they lived is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases, it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of the story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel because that is literally all I'm going to be doing. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580 and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're going to lose your permit. He starts getting funding together. He starts, looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land. And by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. They land and they actually quickly befriend the local Native Americans that are there. And in fact, they invite these English people to come to their village, which was on Roanoke Island, also in North Carolina, not too far from the Outer Banks. And so these early English settlers are brought to this village and they're able to coexist with the Native Americans really beautifully. They're sharing trade secrets, they're learning how to hunt, they're learning how to do all the things that you would need if you were going to live in this new land. And again, they're being embraced by the local population, which was huge. So after 1 month of this reconnaissance mission, that group of early settlers is really excited about the possibilities of settling in America. So they make their way back to England, and they share their findings with Sir Walter Raleigh, and preparations are immediately began to launch an actual colonization effort into Roanoke. So 1 year after this initial reconnaissance mission, Sir Walter Raleigh is ready to launch this full-fledged effort to colonize America. And so he sends 7 ships with 600 men and supplies that were designed to last that group of people for a full year. And so everything's going beautifully. They're sailing their way over to America. And when they reach the Outer Banks, their flagship, the biggest and best ship they had that was carrying the bulk of their supplies, their food, their fresh water, it ran aground, and a lot of their supplies fell into the ocean and were spoiled. And so this is a devastating blow, and they know immediately that, well, not everybody on this fleet can actually land here. So they sent 500 men back to England and only landed 100 of the original 600 in Roanoke. Now, as soon as this second round of settlers, these 100 men, landed in Roanoke, they went and spoke with the local Native Americans. There was already good relationships built from that first reconnaissance mission, and these settlers were given permission by the local natives to build their colony in Roanoke. So they begin constructing their colony, and everything is going off without a hitch. In fact, the Native Americans were incredibly generous. They worked closely with the settlers and did their best to support them however they could. Now, the settlers, they still needed more supplies. They didn't have this robust supply that they planned on having because much of it was destroyed in that shipwreck as they initially made their way in. So they had been promised by the 500 returning crew members that they were going to send supplies by the following winter. So they're anticipating this shipment of new supplies, and as they get closer to the wintertime, the 100 settlers that are there, they're running incredibly low on supplies to the point where they actually basically run out. And so they had to rely on the local Native Americans' generosity just to stay alive. When the shipment that was supposed to be there in the winter did not show up, and in fact had actually been canceled, they didn't know this, it had been canceled by Queen Elizabeth, who basically said that wasn't important, we're going to focus on things that are happening in England. When that doesn't show up, the tensions between these 100 settlers and the local natives, the tension was growing because now there's a huge overdependency. That tension grew to the point where the leader of the settlers and the leader of the local Native Americans began to not trust each other. And in fact, the local natives, instead of being violent, decided that they would just abandon Roanoke and go to the mainland and would just kind of give Roanoke Island to the settlers, and that would kind of solve all the problems. But the English settlers took their retreat as a sign that they were actually going to the mainland of North Carolina, these Native Americans, and were going to be forming alliances with other tribes, and then they were going to come back out and wipe out the 100 settlers. We don't know if that's true because what happens next is the English settlers, in kind of a fit of paranoia, they preemptively cross the water and they make it to the mainland and they attack the Native Americans that had previously been helping them and keeping them alive, and they actually wiped them out. These English settlers come back to Roanoke Island, and now the paranoia is even higher because now they don't have supplies, they don't know how to live there, they've just basically started a war, and it just so happens that an English-bound fleet was passing by the area on their way back to England, and when they stopped at the colony, the settlers were basically in a panic. I mean, at this point, they've just recently wiped out this Native American tribe. They're freaking out about what's going to happen to them. And they were in such a rush to abandon the colony and evacuate that only 97 of them got on the ships and left. They literally left 3 people there. They said, well, they're not here for the evacuation, so we're out of here. And so sure enough, that fleet took the 97 settlers and they left, leaving those 3 settlers to fend for themselves. As irony would have it, just days after this evacuation, Sir Walter Raleigh, he had sent additional ships with resupplies and reinforcements to Roanoke, and they literally arrived like a couple days after this mass evacuation. But when they arrived, the colony was abandoned, and they didn't find those 3 men that were left there. So Sir Walter Raleigh's reinforcements just left. And then a couple weeks later, another English-bound fleet passed by Roanoke and stopped to check in on the colony, and they found it abandoned. And because they had so many people on this fleet that was passing by, they decided to leave 15 crew members at the colony because they felt like this is an English colony. It's not in total disrepair at this point, and perhaps this is going to be useful to the crown, or we can use it in some way. So they leave 15 crew members to basically guard the outpost while they go back to England and figure out what's going to happen next. So it would be months before anybody went back to Roanoke. So those 15 crew members were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. But a man by the name of John White, who had been a part of that initial failed colony in Roanoke, who had evacuated back to England, he was still eager to colonize America. And so he actually convinced Sir Walter Raleigh to launch a new expedition back to America to try to recolonize, not in Roanoke, but slightly north in the Chesapeake Bay, which was just viewed as a more fertile and just more advantageous position. And then in 1587, they send out 3 ships back to America to try this colonization effort all over again. It is important to note that unlike the first effort, which was much more kind of militaristic, it was literally 600 men that got sent to America. This time it was going to be a more kind of civilian approach, where it was men, women, and children being sent over to America to colonize. So with John White as the captain of these 3 ships, they're making their way towards America, and again, their plan was to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area, but they intended to pass by Roanoke on purpose because they knew about those 15 crew members that had been left there, almost a year prior. And so they intended to stop at Roanoke and basically have a meeting with those crew members, give them supplies if they needed it, and then make their way up to the Chesapeake Bay. However, something strange happens where the chief navigator, a man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had navigated during the initial reconnaissance mission, the very first trip to America, also navigated for the second trip to America when they brought the 600 men, now navigating for this 3rd trip with John White. He had the charisma of a real leader and was frankly just very well respected. He's an incredible sailor. And even though John White was technically the captain, really it was Fernandez that really had the respect of all of the people on this trip to America. And so for some reason, Fernandez decided that he just didn't want them to go up to Chesapeake Bay. And instead, when they got to Roanoke to have this meeting with the 15 crew members, he just basically told everybody to get off. Like, we're not gonna go north. Everybody that's here to colonize, go ahead and get off because we're out of here. And John White didn't put up a fight. I think he recognized that the pull this guy had was gonna be too much. And the crew and everybody who was there just kind of accepted it. And so even though it was a total deviation, they just begin to colonize Roanoke, even though, again, that was never their plan. So as they're literally descending upon Roanoke, they're getting ready to meet with these 15 crew members who they're really hoping are still alive, but there's no sign of them. There's no sign of the crew that were left behind, and all they find is like a little pile of bones. And John White speculated that, perhaps this is a sign that the crew members were, attacked by, the Native Americans that were seeking revenge because they had been wiped out from that initial group that had been here, the initial English settlers. John White's suspicions would actually be proven true when just a few days after the 100-plus group of colonists that kind of began setting up camp in Roanoke, a man by the name of George Howe was away from the colony a little bit, and a group of Native Americans surrounded him and shot him with 16 arrows. So it was kind of like a message to the settlers that, like, you're not welcome here. your predecessors that wiped out an entire tribe, yeah, we haven't forgotten about that. So you're not allowed to be here. It was not a good start for John White and his new colony. Feeling like the colony was kind of doomed from the start, the colonists actually told John White, hey, if this is the way it's starting, we need more people here, we need more supplies. Like, this is not a good start. We are not set up for success here. You need to go back to England and get more supplies and bring them back here, because without that, we're doomed. And it just so happened that Fernandez, the guy that had kind of ditched them, he hadn't left the Outer Banks yet. He had anchored at the Outer Banks, and he was basically still available to take people back. And so John White initially was against the idea because he didn't want to be viewed as someone that was kind of abandoning the colony when he got back to England. And John White's daughter, who was pregnant, was there. She was one of the early colonists. She was there in Roanoke, and he didn't want to abandon her. But ultimately, he says, okay, I'll go. And he goes and gets on Fernandez's ship, and they go back to England. Now, unfortunately, when he got back to England, England was in the middle of a war with Spain. And so the Queen had ordered any English ship was basically not allowed to leave England because they needed to be able to defend themselves against the Spanish Armada. And so he wasn't able to leave England to go back to Roanoke, whether he had supplies or not, for 3 years. And so 3 years go by, and he finally, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, is able to be put on a convoy of ships that is going back to America with the necessary supplies. And so he heads off. So it's 1590, 3 years since John White has left Roanoke, left his daughter, and to go back for supplies. Now he's back, and he's got the supplies, and they get to the Outer Banks, and they get in their small boats to make their little journey up around to the north side of Roanoke so they can actually get on the island and go check out what's happening at Roanoke. And when they land on the north side of Roanoke, they start yelling to try to get anybody's attention. There's no answer. As they walk up into the woods, they notice that there are some fresh footprints right on the beach and then in the woods itself. But again, no one's coming to greet them, which is a bit of a bad omen, because if there are fresh tracks, either it's an English settler, in which case they would be eager to come see them, they'd be running out to meet them, or it's a Native American, which could mean they don't trust the English settlers, right? They don't want to show themselves, or they don't want to be seen, which is also kind of ominous. They start moving in to where the Roanoke colony was, and they see 3 letters on a tree. It just says CRO on a tree as they're making their way into the colony. And again, they're yelling the whole time, trying to get anybody's attention, and no one's calling out. There's no sign of life anywhere. So they see CRO on the tree, and then they keep moving closer, and now they break out the colony. And the colony, when they left, had not been heavily fortified. Now it was very heavily fortified with big pikes, basically like wooden pikes lining the outside of this basically looked like a fort. And on one of the wooden posts that was kind of fortifying the outside of Roanoke was the word Croatoan. There is not only nobody inside of this heavily fortified colony, this kind of fort, if you will, it looked like no one had been there in years. The grass was overgrown, basically anything of value had been looted effectively. The only things that were left were like really heavy objects that would have been difficult to move. But there was also no sign of a struggle. There was not like human remains anywhere. There wasn't a clear sign of struggle. I mean, obviously it's this well-fortified area, which leads you to believe that they were at least anticipating some sort of attack, but there was no sign of a struggle. They're just gone. John White, he would write about this experience when he arrived and just discovered the colonies vanished, 115 people just gone, right? He wasn't actually concerned because the writing that he saw on the tree and on the wooden post to him meant something really specific. Before he left to go back to England to get the supplies, he had spoken with the people that would be staying there and said, look, if you need to abandon Roanoke for any reason, we need to have a system worked out to where if I come back and you're gone, I need to know what happened. And so you need to leave me a clue. You need to write a clue somewhere of where your destination is. If you're going by choice, just write the destination. If you're being forced, write the destination with a cross. And that will to me signify that you've left in distress. And so when he sees Croatoan and crow on the tree, to him that just means, oh, well, they must have relocated to the island of Croatoan, which was 50 miles to the south. He would detail in his notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587 to go get those supplies, he said that the settlers had been talking about leaving Roanoke, abandoning Roanoke, and moving 50 miles north to the mainland, not 50 miles south to an island. The concern was the island was isolated and not a good place to have a colony, and so they were talking about leaving it. And so he just kind of casually mentions in his notes, oh, well, they were thinking about leaving to go 50 miles to the mainland, so that might be why they're at Croatoan Island. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you're just kind of abandoning one problem set for another. Like, you want to leave an island because an island has unique problems. Why would you go to another island? You would go to the mainland. So that was kind of problematic. So John White believes they've just up and relocated to the Croatoan Island. And so he quickly takes his men and he goes back to the ship, and they begin to turn and set their course to go south the 50 miles to the Croatoan Island. But as fate would have it, the anchor line snapped as they're trying to make their way south to the Croatoan Island, and the weather was getting progressively worse and worse, and they start drifting north and north until finally the captain of the crew just said, look, we cannot go to the Croatoan Island. It's not going to be possible. And so they had to return to England. John White never would return to America, so he actually would end up dying with absolutely no idea what happened to the colony. And in fact, no one really knew what happened to the colony. It was just this huge cliffhanger. The assumption is they've gone to the Croatoan Island, but no one could prove that they really had. Literally, for centuries, people just speculated as to what could have happened to this colony. I mean, there's the assumption that perhaps they did just go to Croatoan and eventually kind of assimilated with the Native Americans there, and they just became a part of the culture there. There was other theories that they were wiped out at some point by angry Native Americans, but it was all just assumptions until the 1930s, when a small stone was found by a man just out walking around, and he turned it into a museum, and they looked at it, and it was written by Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White, the pregnant daughter that he had abandoned and didn't get to see again. And she detailed what had happened. And half of the colony got wiped out by Native Americans that were angry at them, and then another percentage were taken captive, and then there's a couple survivors that are barely able to survive that don't really expect to live very long. At the time this stone was found, I mean, everybody knew that the last we had heard from the Roanoke colony was that they more than likely had made their way to the Croatoan Island, because that was the word written on the post, the CRO on the tree. I mean, that's what made the most sense. And so why would there be this stone by the daughter of John White 50 miles to the north of Roanoke? Wouldn't it make more sense to have been found on either Roanoke itself or at Croatoan? Like, it didn't really add up. And so a lot of people speculated that that stone had to have just been a fake, a hoax. But in 2011, a major discovery is made in the Roanoke case that actually lends a lot of credibility to the stone that Eleanor Dare had apparently written on. John White was a painter by trade, and he had created all these maps of the colony, of Virginia, of North Carolina, of everywhere he went. He basically painted a map. It was customary at the time, when you were making a map, if you had small mistakes on your map, you would actually cut a new piece of canvas, and you would put the corrections on that piece, and then you would slap it over wherever your mistakes were made. And so it wasn't uncommon, if you were looking at a map, to see little patches kind of all over the map. And so for literally centuries, there were these maps that John White had created that had a number of these little patches on the map. And in 2011, somebody who was researching said, well, why don't we look under the patches and just confirm that they really were just that, little mistakes that were covered up and corrected with a patch. And it turned out that on one of the maps, there was a patch over a section of land 50 miles to the north of Roanoke, around the area where that stone had been found. And underneath the patch was a star. and the star was set to resemble a fort. So basically there is an English fort built, basically where that stone had been found. But it had been covered over with a patch as if the fort was a mistake, right? Like, oh, whoops, shouldn't have been a fort there, and they put a patch over it. But upon closer inspection, the patch that had been put over that X on the map that signified a fort right where that stone had been found, well, on the patch, there was literally hidden ink where someone had drawn a similar X to denote a fort, and they'd put that over the obvious fort symbol that they were covering up. One could maybe make the case that they wanted to signify to someone that was maybe looking for invisible ink, they wanted to signify that that was where the fort was, but they didn't want someone who intercepted the map, for example, the Spanish, because they'd just been at war with the Spanish. They did not want them to know where a location of a fort was. Researchers began calling that site where there was that patch Site X. Now, Site X is 50 miles to the north of Roanoke. And if you recall from what John White had put in his description when he was describing finding the writing on the tree and the posts when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he had referenced that the colony was planning to move 50 miles north to the mainland because that was a more suitable place to live. But of course, with the writing on the trees, everyone thought, oh, well, they end up going to Croatoan. Well, now as Site X, that is a location that lines up with what they had originally said they were going to do. And you have that stone written by Eleanor Dare at the same location. And so archaeologists descended upon the area that was Site X, and while they haven't confirmed that there's a fort or they haven't found a fort in the area, they have found metal and pottery that is potentially indicative of an English settlement. And in fact, right now, they're still doing all sorts of archaeological digs and research to try to determine if that is where the Roanoke colony went. But even if that is the answer to the mystery, that in fact, it was just this hidden map and this stone that said, yep, they went 50 miles north, it doesn't really answer the question, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of the Roanoke colony, of why was Croatoan written on the fence post? Why was Crow written on the tree? Why were they there? And how is it that with all these eyes and all this interest in this case, dating back to literally the 1500s, how has no one ever found even one of the remains of the 115 colonists that apparently just vanished into thin air? So it's a fascinating case with recent developments, which makes it even more fascinating. And I would love to hear if you have any theories about what could have happened.
All the walls are breathing slowly. Cracks like rivers trace the night. Shadows fold around the memory of a love that wouldn't die. I hear your name inside the static, a ghost that moves beneath the glass. Every silence turns cinematic. You just got quiet, like something and you changed the climate. I felt it shift, but said nothing. Now silence grows into something. We used to talk in simple ways, now every word just hesitates. I try to read between the lines, but all I find is empty space. I keep replaying what we said, different meanings in my head. Maybe we were still there then, or maybe it just felt like it. We didn't break, we just bent slow, didn't see it, didn't know how something warm could turn this cold without a sound, without a clue.
Happened to the colonists, to leave it in the comments so we can discuss it. So that's going to do it. If you want to be in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, I'll talk to you guys soon.